Blood pooled on the imported Italian marble as the assassin smirked, assuming the wheelchair-bound Don was entirely defenseless. He never anticipated the soft, curvy Maid stepping directly into the line of fire. Nor did he expect the paralyzed Mafia king to rise from his chair to slaughter him. The Conti syndicate controlled the East Coast underworld with an iron fist, operating out of a sprawling, heavily fortified estate on the rocky cliffs of Long Island, New York. At the center of this criminal empire was Domenico Conti. Feared by politicians and rival bosses alike, Domenico was a man who ruled through sheer terror and calculated brilliance. Yet, the most dangerous man in the Cosa Nostra was confined to a custom-built titanium wheelchair. 20 years ago, when Domenico was just 18, a rival car bomb intended for his father detonated prematurely. The blast took his father's life and shattered Domenico's spine. For 2 decades, his lower half had been a graveyard of dead nerves. The wealthiest doctors in Manhattan and the finest neurologists in Europe had taken his money, shaken their heads, and told him he would never walk again. Over time, the hope died, leaving behind a cold, ruthless ghost of a man who trusted no one and destroyed anyone who showed him pity. Hortensia Marino was a ghost of a different kind. She was 24, carrying generous curves that the leaner, glamorous women of the Mafia world constantly mocked. With her soft stomach, thick thighs, and quiet demeanor, Hortensia was entirely invisible in the ruthless environment of the Conti estate. She had been hired as a low-level cleaner for the East Wing, a job she took out of desperate necessity. Her late grandfather had been a brilliant but disgraced underground physician for the mob. Before he was murdered over a botched surgery on a cartel boss, he had taught Hortensia everything he knew. She understood human anatomy, complex nerve regeneration, and old-world deep tissue manipulation better than any board-certified surgeon. But with crippling debts left behind by her family, she hid her medical genius behind a maid's uniform, keeping her head down and scrubbing floors to survive. Hortensia was never supposed to cross paths with the Don. Her domain was the endless corridors of the guest wings, far away from Domenico's heavily guarded private quarters. But fate, or perhaps the sheer incompetence of the head housekeeper, intervened on a stormy Tuesday evening. The regular maid for the master suite had quit after Domenico threw a crystal whiskey decanter at the wall near her head. Desperate, the staff shoved a bucket and cleaning supplies into Hortensia's hands and pushed her toward the heavy oak doors of the boss's sanctuary. The room was cloaked in shadows, smelling of expensive tobacco and aged scotch. Domenico sat near the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the violent waves crashing against the Long Island cliffs. He did not turn around when Hortensia entered, assuming she was just another terrified servant. Hortensia quietly went about her work, her plush figure moving with surprising grace as she dusted the mahogany bookshelves and polished the marble surfaces. She tried not to look at him, but her medically trained eyes could not help but analyze the man. She noticed the slight, unnatural angle of his posture, the rigid tension in his broad shoulders, and the way his knuckles were white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. Suddenly, a violent tremor racked Domenico's body. It was a severe spasm of phantom pain, a cruel trick of a broken nervous system that sent agonizing electrical shocks through muscles he could no longer control. He gasped, his massive frame convulsing as his hands slipped from the wheels. The tray of untouched food beside him crashed to the floor, shattering plates and spilling hot coffee over the rugs. Guards immediately burst into the room, followed closely by Domenico's overpaid, cowardly personal physician. The doctor bumbled forward with a syringe of heavy sedatives, the usual treatment to simply knock the boss out until the phantom agony passed. Domenico roared in pain and humiliation, batting the doctor's hand away. He hated the sedatives. They clouded his mind and made him vulnerable. But the pain was blinding, wrapping around his lower spine like barbed wire. Hortensia watched the chaotic scene unfold. She saw the doctor preparing to forcefully inject Domenico, treating the ruthless Mafia boss like a rabid animal. Before she could think of the consequences, her hidden instincts took over. She dropped her cleaning rags and pushed through the armed guards. The men were too shocked by the sudden movement of the quiet, plump maid to draw their weapons in time. Hortensia shoved the startled doctor aside, snatching the syringe from his hand and tossing it across the room. Domenico's dark, furious eyes snapped to her. He was panting, his face pale with agony, ready to order her execution for daring to touch him. But Hortensia did not flinch under his murderous glare. She knelt beside his wheelchair, her soft, warm hands immediately finding the exact lumbar vertebrae at the base of his spine. Her grandfather had taught her about the misfiring synapses of paralyzed trauma victims. She applied a sudden, immense pressure with her thumbs, digging into the scar tissue and manipulating the deep nerve clusters with a brutal precision that conventional medicine forbade. Domenico gasped, his body going completely rigid. The agonizing electrical storm in his legs vanished, replaced by an intense, burning heat spreading from her fingertips. For the first time in 20 years, the sensation did not feel like phantom pain. It felt real. It felt like pressure. Hortensia looked up, her breathing heavy, her dark eyes locking with his. She did not cower. She did not apologize. She simply held his gaze, her hands still pressed firmly against his lower back. The room fell into a deathly silence. The guards waited for Domenico to give the nod to drag her out and shoot her. Instead, Domenico slowly lifted his hand, waving the guards and the trembling doctor out of the room. He did not break eye contact with the curvy maid kneeling at his feet. A strange, dark obsession ignited in his chest. In a world full of assassins and monsters, this soft, unremarkable woman had just touched him without trembling, and she had quieted the storm in his severed spine. By the next morning, Hortensia's life had drastically changed. Domenico had fired his personal physician and ordered that the plus-sized maid be moved into the bedroom adjacent to his suite. She was no longer permitted to clean the East Wing. She was now the Don's exclusive personal attendant. The entire syndicate whispered about the bizarre promotion, but no one dared question Domenico Conti. Behind the heavy oak doors, a strange and intense dynamic began to form. Hortensia started a grueling, clandestine physical therapy regimen on Domenico. Every evening, she would order the guards away, lock the doors, and force the most dangerous man in New York out of his chair and onto a medical table. She used her full body weight to manipulate his atrophied muscles, her soft curves pressing against his hardened, scarred torso, as she stretched and bent limbs that had been dead to the world since the late 90s. Domenico was captivated. He was a man who took whatever he wanted, but he found himself completely, entirely at the mercy of this woman. He watched the way sweat beaded on her forehead, the way her thick, beautiful thighs braced against the table for leverage, and the fierce concentration in her eyes. She did not treat him like a broken king, nor did she treat him with the terrified reverence his soldiers did. When he cursed at her in Italian due to the deep tissue pain, she coldly told him to shut up and breathe. His obsession deepened into a possessive, consuming fire. He wanted to shield her from the brutal world outside that room, but he also selfishly wanted her entirely to himself. The fragile peace within the estate was shattered by the arrival of Octavia Berardi. Octavia was the underboss of the Chicago outfit, a vicious, razor-thin woman who wore designer suits and possessed a heart of pure ice. The Berardi family had been steadily encroaching on Conti territory, testing the waters because they believed Domenico's paralysis made him a weak sitting duck. Octavia came to the Long Island compound under the guise of negotiating shipping routes out of the Brooklyn Navy yards. The meeting took place in the grand dining hall. Domenico sat at the head of the long table in his wheelchair, his face an emotionless mask. Hortensia stood quietly in the corner, pouring water and acting as a servant to maintain her cover. Octavia paced the room, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor. She spoke of territories and margins, but her words were laced with subtle venom directed at Domenico's condition. As Octavia passed Hortensia, she paused, her cold eyes dragging up and down Hortensia's fuller figure with outright disgust. Without warning, Octavia bumped her shoulder hard against Hortensia, causing the crystal water pitcher to slip. Ice water splashed over the table and onto Octavia's expensive shoes. Octavia slapped Hortensia across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the massive hall. "Look at this clumsy, fat peasant," Octavia sneered, wiping her shoe with a napkin. "Is this the standard of the Conti family now, Domenico? Surrounding yourself with bloated, useless trash? No wonder your empire is crumbling while you sit rotting in that chair." The temperature in the room plummeted to sub-zero. The Conti soldiers standing by the doors tensed, their hands hovering over their holsters. Hortensia kept her head down, her cheek burning red, fully expecting Domenico to remain silent, to keep the peace with the Chicago outfit. A maid's pride was not worth a Mafia war. Domenico's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a lethal, terrifying weight. "Get on your knees." Octavia stopped laughing and looked at him, raising an elegant eyebrow. "Excuse me." Domenico leaned forward, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the table. His eyes were completely devoid of humanity. I said, "Get on your knees, Octavia, and clean the water off my floor with your tongue. If you refuse, my men will cut off your hands, and I will mail them to your brother in a shoebox." Octavia's face drained of color. She looked at the Conti soldiers, realizing in horror that they had already drawn their weapons and aimed them at her chest. Domenico was entirely serious. He was willing to ignite a catastrophic war with the Chicago mob over an insult directed at a maid. Octavia swallowed her pride, her hands shaking as she slowly lowered herself to the marble floor, humiliated in front of her own guards. Domenico did not watch her. His burning gaze was fixed entirely on Hortensia, silently promising that no one would ever harm her again. Later that night, the adrenaline from the dining room incident still lingered in the air. Hortensia was silent as she worked her hands deeply into the muscles of Domenico's right calf. She was furious that he had risked his entire syndicate for her, but an undeniable dark warmth bloomed in her chest at his ruthless protection. As she applied a painful pressure point technique just below his knee, Domenico suddenly inhaled sharply. His hand flew out, gripping Hortensia's wrist with bruising force. Hortensia froze, her heart pounding. "Did I press too hard?" she asked softly. Domenico stared at her, his chest heaving. He slowly let go of her wrist and looked down at his own legs. The silence in the room was deafening. Hortensia followed his gaze. She watched in absolute, breathless shock as Domenico concentrated, a vein popping in his neck. Slowly, agonizingly, the big toe on his right foot twitched. It was a microscopic movement, a millimeter of motion. but in the medical world, it was a miracle. The dead nerves were waking up. The bridge across his severed spine was rebuilding itself through her relentless, ancient techniques. Domenico looked back up at her, tears of pure disbelief shining in his hardened, murderous eyes. Hortensia let out a choked sob, falling forward and burying her face in his chest. Domenico wrapped his massive arms around her plush body, pulling her tightly against him. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in her scent. They shared a dangerous secret now. The dawn was healing, but outside those locked doors, Octavia Berardi was retreating to Chicago with a heart full of vengeance. She had been humiliated, and she was not a woman who forgave. Convinced that Domenico was hopelessly paralyzed and easily outmaneuvered, Octavia began drafting orders for a synchronized assassination across all Conti territories. She planned to strike the Long Island estate directly, intending to slaughter the crippled boss in his chair. She had no idea that a curvy maid from the slums was actively giving the devil back his legs, and that when Octavia returned to finish the job, she would not find a crippled victim, but a standing king ready to bathe the East Coast in blood. Over the next 3 months, the heavily guarded master suite of the Long Island estate became a crucible of pain, sweat, and dark devotion. The secret of Domenico Conti was guarded with absolute lethal force. Anyone who even lingered too long in the East Wing corridor was quietly relocated or disposed of by his most loyal enforcers. To the outside world, the Don was still a broken man, ruling his empire from a titanium wheelchair. Inside the room, however, a terrifying resurrection was taking place. Hortensia Marino pushed Domenico beyond the limits of human endurance. Her grandfather's underground medical journals had mapped out the exact, brutal physiotherapy required to force dormant nerves back into submission, but it required a tolerance for agony that few men possessed. Domenico possessed it in spades. He refused painkillers. He refused breaks. Every evening, he allowed this soft-spoken, full-figured woman to subject him to excruciating deep tissue manipulation, stretching atrophied tendons and forcing his legs to bear weight against the oak medical braces she had secretly smuggled into the estate. The physical proximity sparked a dangerous, consuming fire between them. Hortensia could no longer deny the dark pull she felt toward the Mafia boss. Despite his monstrous reputation and the blood on his hands, Domenico treated her with a reverence that bordered on religious worship. When she pushed him to the point of exhaustion, her chest heaving and her thick thighs trembling from supporting his massive frame, he did not look at her with the disgust she had endured from others all her life. He looked at her as if she were the only breathing creature on earth. One freezing January night, the wind howling against the bulletproof glass of the estate, Domenico took his first unassisted step. Hortensia was standing a few feet away, her arms outstretched, her heart hammering against her ribs. Domenico pushed himself up from the parallel wooden bars. His broad, heavily scarred chest was slick with sweat. His legs, once completely dead to the world, shook violently under his weight. But he did not fall. His dark eyes locked onto Hortensia, drawing strength from the fierce, unwavering belief radiating from her face. With a guttural growl, he forced his right foot forward. The floorboards creaked. Then he dragged his left foot forward. He closed the distance between them and collapsed, not onto the floor, but directly into Hortensia's arms. The sheer momentum sent them both crashing back onto the plush velvet sofa. Hortensia let out a breathless laugh, tears streaming down her face as she wrapped her arms around his thick neck. "You did it," she whispered fiercely into his ear. "You walked, Domenico." Domenico did not speak. He buried his face in the soft crook of her neck, inhaling the sweet scent of vanilla and lavender that always clung to her skin. His massive hands, which had choked the life out of rival bosses, gently traced the lush curves of her waist and the flare of her wide hips. He pulled her flush against his hardened body, a silent oath passing between them. She had given him back his legs, and in return he would give her the world. He kissed her then, a desperate, bruising claim that sealed her fate to the Mafia underworld forever. Hortensia surrendered completely to the dark romance, knowing she was entirely tethered to a monster, but realizing he was a monster who would burn cities to the ground to keep her warm. While the king was quietly rebuilding his strength, the vultures were circling. In Chicago, Octavia Berardi was meticulously planning the downfall of the Conti syndicate. Her humiliation in the Long Island dining hall had festered into a venomous obsession. Octavia had spent the winter funneling millions of dollars into buying the loyalty of corrupt port authorities, rival street gangs, and most dangerously, a high-ranking captain inside Domenico's own family. Lorenzo, a greedy capo who managed the Conti family's gambling rings in Queens, had grown tired of kicking up a percentage of his earnings to a man he viewed as a crippled relic. Octavia offered Lorenzo the East Coast throne in exchange for his help in bypassing the compound's legendary security. Lorenzo agreed, handing over the blueprints to the estate's electrical grid and the patrol schedules of Domenico's private guard. The plan was a synchronized decapitation strike. Octavia would personally lead a heavily armed tactical team of Berardi hitmen across the Long Island Sound on stealth speedboats under the cover of a massive winter blizzard. They would breach the cliffs, while Lorenzo disabled the perimeter alarms and the thermal cameras. Octavia's mandate to her men was simple and merciless. Leave no survivors in the compound, but leave Domenico Conti alive just long enough to watch his empire burn before putting a bullet between his eyes. She also added a specific, cruel order regarding the plus-sized maid who had caused her so much embarrassment. Octavia wanted Hortensia's head on a silver platter, as the worst blizzard in a decade battered the New York coastline, dumping feet of snow and plunging the temperature into the single digits. The Berardi speedboats cut through the freezing black water. The storm provided the perfect cover, drowning out the roar of their engines. Inside the estate, the atmosphere was quiet, completely unaware that a massacre was minutes away. Hortensia was in the master bathroom, running a hot Epsom salt bath to soothe Domenico's screaming muscles after a grueling 3-hour walking session. Domenico sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands, feeling the blood pumping vigorously through his lower extremities. The numbness was completely gone, replaced by a raw, powerful vitality. He was a lethal weapon fully restored, hiding in plain sight. Suddenly, the lights in the master suite flickered and died. The hum of the central heating system ground to a halt. The estate was plunged into pitch-black darkness. Domenico's survival instincts, honed from decades of underworld warfare, kicked in instantly. He did not call out. He reached under his mattress in the dark and pulled out a heavy, suppressed tactical pistol. A second later, the muffled sound of suppressed gunfire echoed from the lower levels of the estate. The heavy thud of bodies hitting the marble floors confirmed his worst fear. The compound had been breached. Hortensia stumbled out of the bathroom, using the dim moonlight filtering through the snow-covered windows to find her way. "Domenico," she whispered, panic threading her voice. Domenico grabbed her wrist, pulling her down behind the heavy oak bed frame. "We are under attack," he stated, his voice a chilling monotone devoid of fear. "Stay behind me. Do not make a sound." Outside the master doors, the corridor became a slaughterhouse. Domenico's elite guards fought fiercely, but they were ambushed in the dark by hitmen wearing night vision goggles. Blood painted the expensive wallpaper as the Berardi forces systematically cleared the rooms. Octavia Berardi walked over the corpses of the Conti soldiers, a customized submachine gun resting casually in her arms. She kicked open the door to the east wing, a predatory smile stretching across her sharp, aristocratic features. She knew Domenico was trapped, without power to operate the estate's elevators or emergency lifts. The wheelchair-bound Don was marooned in his suite. "Blow the doors," Octavia commanded her men, pointing toward the heavy mahogany entrance of the master bedroom. A directional explosive charge shattered the reinforced wood, sending smoking splinters flying across the room. Octavia stepped through the ruined doorway, flanked by 4 heavily armed enforcers. The moonlight illuminated the overturned wheelchair in the center of the room. It was empty. Octavia laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that bounced off the high ceilings. "Crawling on the floor like a rat, Domenico?" she called out. "Did your fat little maid try to carry you away?" She spotted Hortensia crouching near the shattered remnants of a floor mirror. Hortensia's heart was beating so violently she thought her ribs would crack. But she remembered Domenico's silent command in the dark. She stayed down, her eyes wide with terror, acting as the perfect bait. "Grab the pig," Octavia ordered, gesturing with the barrel of her gun. "I want to shoot her in the kneecaps before I blow Domenico's brains out." 2 Berardi hitmen stepped forward, slinging their rifles over their shoulders to grab Hortensia. They never made it halfway across the room. From the deep shadows of the alcove behind them, a massive figure stepped out. He did not roll. He did not crawl. He walked. Before the hitmen could even register the impossible sight of Domenico Conti standing at his full imposing height of 6'4", the suppressed pistol in his hand coughed twice. The 2 men dropped dead, hollow point rounds severing their brain stems. Octavia spun around, her eyes widening in absolute, paralyzing horror. The world seemed to stop spinning. The invincible, crippled Don of New York was standing directly in front of her, moving with the terrifying, fluid grace of an apex predator. His broad shoulders blocked out the moonlight, casting a monstrous shadow over her. "Shoot him!" Octavia screamed, her voice cracking in pure panic as she fumbled to raise her submachine gun. But Domenico was faster, moving with a feral speed born from 20 years of repressed rage. He lunged forward, grabbing the barrel of Octavia's weapon with his bare, scarred hand, and forcing it upward as she pulled the trigger. Bullets chewed uselessly into the ceiling. With his other hand, Domenico drove a brutal, shattering punch into the throat of the 3rd hitman, collapsing his windpipe instantly. The 4th man managed to draw a knife, but Domenico simply absorbed the slashing blade into his forearm without flinching, twisted the man's wrist until the bone snapped violently, and drove his own knife directly into the man's chest. In less than 10 seconds, Octavia's elite guard was entirely decimated. The room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the howling blizzard outside and the ragged breathing of the Chicago underboss. Octavia stumbled backward, dropping her useless weapon. She hit the wall, her legs giving out completely as she slid to the floor. She looked up at the Titan towering over her, her mind fracturing at the impossibility of it all. "You are paralyzed," she choked out, blood spattering her expensive designer coat. "You are supposed to be a cripple." Domenico leaned down, grabbing Octavia by the hair and tilting her head back against the wall. His dark eyes were bottomless pits of violence. "I am the King of New York, Octavia," he whispered, his voice vibrating with lethal promise. "And you touched my queen." He did not waste another word. He raised his weapon and ended the Chicago threat with a single, deafening shot. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Domenico stood amidst the carnage, his chest rising and falling slowly. The blood dripping from his wounded forearm was the only sound in the room. He turned slowly, his merciless eyes sweeping the room until they found Hortensia. She was standing up now, trembling, staring at the unbelievable violence he had just unleashed. But she did not run. She did not look at him with fear. She stepped carefully over the bodies, reached up with her soft hands, and gently touched the bloody gash on his arm. "We need to stitch this," she murmured softly, her thumb brushing against his hardened skin. Domenico let out a ragged breath, the monster receding as he looked down at the curvy, beautiful woman who had literally pulled him from the grave. He dropped his gun, wrapping his massive arms around her waist, burying his face in the crook of her neck, grounding himself in her warmth. By sunrise, the blizzard had passed, and the Conti estate was secure. Lorenzo the traitor was found and dealt with in the soundproof basement. The surviving Berardi men were sent back to Chicago in pieces as a final warning. A week later, Domenico Conti called a massive summit of all the East Coast bosses. They arrived expecting to see a weakened man in a wheelchair, vulnerable from the recent attack. Instead, the doors of the grand hall swung open, and Domenico walked in, his heavy boots echoing against the marble floors, his presence dominating the room entirely. Gasps of shock and terror rippled through the underworld elite. The devil had his legs back. But what shocked them more was the woman walking by his side. Hortensia Marino, the plus-sized maid who had once scrubbed their floors, walked into the room radiating a quiet, undeniable power. She wore a stunning, custom-tailored black silk dress that hugged every generous curve, a diamond collar resting against her throat. Domenico did not take his seat at the head of the table immediately. He turned to Hortensia, kissed her hand in front of the most dangerous men in America, and pulled out the chair beside his throne for her. She was no longer the invisible maid in the shadows. She was the absolute center of Domenico Conti's violent universe, the undisputed queen of the East Coast, and heaven help the man who ever dared to disrespect her again. If this dark, high-stakes mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Hortensia and Domenico's intense journey from a broken king and a hidden savior to the most powerful couple in the underworld proves that true strength comes in unexpected forms. Share this story with your fellow dark romance lovers. Drop a comment below on what